Hello, everyone. It is my honor to welcome all of you to our second of 4 collaboratory conversations on the topic of virtual education, well-being, and equity during the current global health crisis. My name is Taylor Hausburg, and I'm an EDD student at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education. As someone who studies social emotional learning, I feel very grateful to all of you for your interest in mental health and well-being, and to our panelists for sharing their expertise in this field with us. Before we dive into the content of today's conversation, I'd like to first set a few norms for our time together. There are over 200 people registered for this event, which is incredibly exciting, but also necessitates that we establish a few ground rules. First, please keep your audio and video muted until we invite you to turn them on. And secondly, if you have any technical issues or need assistance at any time, please send a chat message to our tech master, Janine Remillard. Let me review the agenda for today's conversation. I'll begin by introducing the topic and our panelists. Then, in the spirit of sustaining our own well-being, Reverend Grace Song will lead us in a short meditation. We will then hear from each panelist for approximately 10 minutes. During that time, if you have any questions for the panelists, please send a chat message to me, Taylor Hausburg. We will have time for a few questions after all of the panelists have presented. Nicole will be typing notes for folks to refer to in the chat box. After the whole group Q&A, we will devote our remaining time together to breakout conversations so that you all can have a chance to engage with each other. And now, on to today's topic, sustaining our own and prospective teachers' mental health and well-being. While this topic is always important, it may be even more important right now, as so many student teachers have been removed from their field placements, where they were developing their professional skills, identities, and relationships with young people. Our own student teachers tell us that without the opportunity to apply what they're learning to their planning and teaching, their coursework has now begun to feel meaningless. Plus, they miss their students very much. There's a strong sense of frustration, loss, and grief for prospective teachers and for us, the teacher educators who support their growth. That's why we've invited 3 experts who work with mental health in a variety of fields to join us here today. We see this as a wonderful opportunity to learn from diverse experiences and perspectives on supporting mental health, and to consider how we as teacher educators can apply their insights to our work with teachers. So, without further ado, let me briefly introduce our 3 panelists. Reverend Grace Song is chair of the Won Institute of Graduate Studies and teaches classes in the Master of Won Buddhist Studies degree program. The Won Institute is the only higher education institution offering the study of Won Buddhism. Dr. Jean Felter is a professional counselor and education psychologist. This is a small revision. In addition to serving as not director, but chair of the Counseling and Behavioral Health Department at Thomas Jefferson University, Dr. Felter also supervises first-year students who are involved in field placements. She has extensive experience working in community and school-based mental health settings, and has particular expertise working with urban children, adolescents, and families who have endured adversity and traumatic stress. Finally, Xavier Brown is a practicum site supervisor at Penn's Graduate School of Education, where he supervises master's students in 2 programs, the School and Mental Health Counseling and Counseling and Mental Health Services programs. Some of his areas of expertise include one-on-one and group counseling, student support initiatives, and social emotional development. Xavier is also an advisor to Penn GSE's Urban Teaching Apprenticeship Program, where he works to provide targeted support to student teachers of color. You will notice that Dr. Marcia Richardson is not among the panelists here today as advertised. Unfortunately, Marcia recently suffered from a knee injury and is tending to her physical health at this moment. So with that, I'll now turn it over to Grace to lead us in a brief meditation.
Thank you, Taylor. So I will start with the sound of the bell, and I invite you to gently close your eyes. If you feel uncomfortable closing your eyes, just keep your gaze slightly downwards. Just settling into your chair. Just taking a deep breath or two to release any tension that you may be holding in your body. And in this practice, let yourself remember a strong and steady, wonderful tree that you have seen sometime in your life. It could be a tree you've seen in the mountains or in your travels. It could be one that's local, or it could be a sequoia or redwood. Just let an image and a memory of a great tree appear. And as you remember and sense and picture this tree, just sense yourself under it nearby, just gazing at the strong trunk, gazing up at the canopy of leaves. And allow this tree to become a teacher for you as you stand in front of the tree. Sense its roots going deep into the earth, steadying it through winds and storms, through rainbows and clouds, through beautiful days and droughts. Notice just the deep roots in the earth keep it steady. And learn from the tree now. Feel in the same way as the tree teaches you your own deep roots of connections to life. Going into the earth. You are rooted in this earth. This is your home. And just let yourself feel as if you too are a sister or a brother to this great tree, with roots in the earth, a strong trunk, and branches open to the sky. In this deep rootedness, just let fears and tensions drain back into the earth. You are the tree of life in the midst of it all. Sense your rootedness. Staying grounded and rooted deeply, flexible and connected with the force of life. And when you're ready, you may allow your eyes to open again.
Thank you so much for that, Grace. That was a much needed reminder of our connection to nature at this moment where we're all so secluded in our homes. So thank you for that. So we'll now begin the panelist presentations. I asked each panelist to think about 2 questions to guide what they share with us today. First, what strategies do you recommend for self-care? And secondly, what strategies do you recommend for supporting others, in this case, prospective teachers, dealing with these challenges? And we'll start again with Grace as our first panelist.
Thank you, Taylor. So I'm really glad to be here with all of you and have this time to reflect together on how we can respond to this global crisis we're in with a wise heart. And life is different now for everyone. This pandemic has toppled our routines, our plans. Some people have fears that are much more survival-based, physical survival, financial survival. And while there is a lot of uncertainty and this raw vulnerability, on the other side, there's an enormous sense of possibility, of potential that what's unfolding can wake up more love and it can wake up more awareness in our world. So as one of my teachers says, it's like suffering can turn you inwards towards your most precious spiritual resources, that inner refuge of courage, of wisdom and calm. So how can we stay centered? How can we stay steady for ourselves and those around us? I want to begin by just pointing out that in our life, there are certain things like the external conditions that are beyond our control. And that's palpable today as we're going through this situation, doing the social distancing, having to abide by certain rules and regulations in order to help this situation to subside. But what is in our hands is how we respond to the situation. And Shaktideva, an Indian scholar of the 7th century, pointed out that, in the world covered with thorns and thistles, thorns and pebbles, if we walk barefoot across this path, we would stub our toes and hurt ourselves. But what are we going to do? Carpet the earth? That's impossible. But what we can do is put 2 slabs of leather under our feet to create sandals, so that when we do walk, we are protected and we can walk anywhere. So just like that in our life, we're always going to meet situations that don't come up to our expectations. But we don't need to fret, because if we learn how to tame and cultivate our own mind, then we can deal with everything outside. And that's really one of the self-care tips that I really want to share with you today, is the importance, especially as educators, of having a very strong personal daily meditation practice. Our culture is so into taking care of our bodies. You hear that a lot on TV, you know, eat this and be healthy, train your body to look like this. But the question is, how much exercise do we do that for the mind? And as you all know, since now that we're indoors, our mind is our home in many ways. We're in our mind. So what's most important, I feel, during this time, and even in preparation for the future, is to really build into our life a daily practice. And I say daily, not weekly, once a week, but a very personal daily practice, so that everyday life becomes practice. And when we do that, when we work with the mind, which I'll talk about in more detail a bit later, we develop a mind that is very totally present, that is also spacious, and it's, you know, not doing the chatter all the time. Because unless you're really well trained with the mind, normally what happens is that when you're doing one thing, you're thinking about 100 other things. The one thing you're usually not thinking about is what you're really doing. So for example, right now that we're in Zoom world, what can happen is we get easily distracted. All of you, your cameras are off right now. I have no idea what you're doing. You could be concentrating on me right now, or you could be checking your email or sending messages. Who knows? But the mind is so subtle and precarious that it can do that. And so the whole idea is to have time for ourselves during the day to really settle the mind, settle the thinking, and really focus on object of awareness. And this practice of meditation is not something that should be rigid or tight or exhausting. Right? It should be a practice that helps us to stay precise, but with complete awareness. So one of the things I want to share is that when you're thinking about building your personal practice, is think about what time of the day you want to integrate it. Some people feel that the mornings are more comfortable for practice. Some prefer the evening. Find out what time of the day works for you. And I say that the best teacher is nature. The best teacher is nature, because if you look at nature in the early morning, very quiet, pure, perfect time to reset. During the day, it's a bit busier. Our minds are busier. We're working. So some people, what they tend to do is they'll practice in the morning, do a short practice. And then in the evening, instead of transitioning right into a silent meditation, they'll do a practice such as chanting or moving meditation to help settle the mind. So what's important is, when you're doing the practice too, is to have self-compassion towards yourself. Because what can happen is we can become very judgmental to ourselves. Why am I not practicing? You know, why can't I concentrate? That involuntary negative banter that happens, and you get on that negative train of thinking, it goes on and on and on. So putting that self-compassion in there and saying, you know what, I'm doing the best that I can. And when I talk to teachers, many of them will say they get very motivated in the beginning, and they'll do 30 minutes, 40 minutes. But what I suggest is to start small. It could be even a few minutes of just silent meditation a day. And don't worry if you stop midway. Some people, they'll come to me and they'll say, I haven't practiced in months. I feel like such a bad practitioner. And then I tell them my own story about dedication. One of my teachers asked me, they're like, Grace, what do you think dedication is? I said, well, doing something perfectly from A to B, right, without stopping. And my teacher said, let me give you another definition. And he said, true dedication is when you're doing something and then sometimes you may stop. You may just have that lull in your practice. But true dedication is getting back up again and trying again and not stopping. So I hope that gives you some hope as well, that there are times when we may stop, but that's okay. Start again. And that's true dedication. And in terms of, supporting students or giving them advice on how to also, deal with their stresses during this time, what I want to say is that it really starts with me first. When I renew myself, when I have my own centeredness and groundedness, that energy also extends and supports my students. So when I trained educators in mindfulness, the very first rule is I practice what I preach. When I teach something to my students, when I support them, I'm also doing it myself, right? And what happens is that when we renew ourselves, that has a ripple effect. So it automatically also renews my students, renews my family, renews my community. So I always say, when you go inward, and become one with yourself, you're automatically going outward, and becoming one with those around you, which seems all the more important, especially during this time when we're beginning to see how interdependent we are, that we are not islands. We do not live on an island. My actions, my thought have repercussions. And to see this invisible, they call it the invisible virus, but something that happened in one country and that spread. And it just goes to show how connected we are, but also shows the strength of social solidarity, that we are interdependent, and then for us to get through this requires for us to work together. So that realization of interdependence also helps us to open up our heart, to start connecting with other people, and also seeing that what other people wish for is very similar to what I wish for, this wish for happiness. And when we realize that, when we talk to our students too, our heart is open so that we can become more active listeners, and that we can be an anchor for them as well. So yes, I feel that time is, I see Taylor turned on her camera, so that's, yeah. So I just want to also just say, as we're going through celebrating goodness that's out there, just connecting with nature too as well. So going inwards, connecting with ourselves, connecting outwards. And so I want to thank everyone for your precious attention. Thanks so much.
And thank you so much, Grace. That was beautiful. Thank you. So as a reminder, if all of you have any questions for Grace, please direct chat them to me. We're now going to welcome our next panelist, Jean.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here. And I, like you, am faculty, and I have students who are counseling students who are also feeling like they're abandoning their clients. And, they have their own vulnerabilities at this time. So we as faculty have to wear a lot of different hats in being able to support them through this time. So what I really want to focus on today is, for me, when I think about mental health and well-being, those terms are really synonymous with optimal brain functioning. I wanted to spend my time today really introducing you, or perhaps for some of you, reintroducing the potential impact of stress on the brain, and consequently on how it shows up in our behaviors. So as you know, as educators and teachers, stress is not a bad thing. As educators, we should not be working to alleviate the stress of our students. When stress is experienced as predictable, when it is moderately intense, and when it's controlled, it actually helps us to function very well. Stress can be motivating. I know for me, I need stress to hit deadlines, to produce important products. It helps us to learn to problem solve. Stress can help us to evolve into really high functioning adults. But it's when stress is unpredictable, when it's severe, when it's prolonged, then it can really lead to vulnerabilities. So here in Philadelphia, many of us are already serving children and families who have experienced layers upon layers of chronic adversity in their communities and their families. And if you know about the ACE study, you know that this means that For those people that we serve, and actually for many of us, we're already susceptible to an array of negative health and psychological outcomes. And now as we face this current pandemic, which is really this truly global crisis, it's unprecedented, and it's continuing to ravage more pointedly our poorer communities, we layer onto that rocky foundation the collapse, as Grace said, of so many of our economic and social and interpersonal supports, and these collapsed for many of us virtually overnight. This may actually be the first time in our history when the world is experiencing together, all together, such a heightened degree of stress. There is this newfound, seemingly universal experience of worry, an experience of hopelessness and fear, without any clear end in sight. And remember what I said earlier, that when stress is prolonged, when it's unpredictable, and when it's severe, it can really lead to vulnerabilities. But I want you to know this, that stress is really our reaction to stressors. We are really not able to adjust or mitigate the stressors that we're currently facing, but we can learn to respond to them differently. Mental health is far more a function of how we respond to stress than the quantity or severity of stressors that we face. So how does this chronic state of stress show up in all of us, and what can we do about it? I want us to think about our brains, and Dan Siegel's hand-brain model is what I find to be one of the best ways to illustrate this. So I can't see all of you, but I'm hoping that you'll kind of play along with me here and make a hand-brain using what you have in front of you. So if you make a fist, like you see in the image, this fist is really going to represent our brain. I'm hoping that my brain is a little larger than my fist, but it might not be, but it's really supposed to be an image of the brain. And when we open our hand, like in the image on the bottom, the wrist and the palm represent the oldest regions of the brain, which we call the reptilian brain. This is our brainstem and our spinal cord. And then when we pull our thumb across the palm, like in that second image there, this represents our midbrain, the limbic system. And then finally, when you close your fingers over the thumb, this top region, represented by our fingers, is the cortex. So if you could advance to the second slide. The brain develops from the bottom up. So that reptilian region that we talked about, the brainstem and spinal cord, that's really present since birth, and it's our survival brain. It is the part that controls respiration and heart rate and temperature. And it is really where our survival instincts reside, those fight, flight, freeze instincts. That middle portion, which was represented by our thumb, is also a more primitive part of our brain. This, when I talk to my students, I want them to think about this part as being the smoke detector. This is the structure that's constantly evaluating and assessing the environment for threat. And it's doing so outside of our conscious awareness. So it's doing it for you right now, even though most of you, I think, are paying attention here. It is a highly emotionally reactive region of our brain. And if it does truly sense threat, it immediately brings online that survival part of our brain. And then there's that cortex that we talked about. This is the region that truly makes us human. This is where all the executive functioning lives. This is where abstract thinking, creativity, collaboration, even empathy and perspective taking lives in this cortex. And it isn't fully formed in each of us until our mid to late 20s. And I wanted to introduce you to these brain regions so that we can now begin to consider together how behaviors that we see in our students and in ourselves, and for our students working in schools, the behaviors that they see in their students are truly windows into brain states. When we are aggressive, when we are short-tempered, when we are reactive or explosive or fearful, anxious, we tend to be operating in these lower regions. But when we are thoughtful, when we are compassionate, creative, focused, this is our cortex, being fully engaged and online. If I were teaching, your students right now, I would ask them, Instead of being on this panel, I'd ask them to make a list of the behaviors that they see in their students that would represent these different brain states. And I would ask you to also think about yourself. What are the things that are showing up for you that show that you're operating in these lower regions? When we are under tremendous stress, the lower regions of our brain get stronger, like a muscle, and they hijack our thinking brain. For many of us, I know for me, I was saying I have 3 teenagers in the house. I have a 110-pound dog. The house feels pretty small. I'm finding myself to be more frequently in my lower brain. I'm feeling a little bit more reactive, a little less in control. I'm having more difficulty concentrating, having some trouble sleeping, feeling a little bit more inflexible, feeling anxious. And for me, that is indicative of kind of these lower regions of the brain. Self-care to me is really about understanding our own brain-based reactions and strengthening the cortex so that we can keep those lower regions at bay. Please show the final slide. This model is adapted from Dr. Jessica Payne's work out of the University of Notre Dame, and she's this brilliant neuropsychologist and sleep scientist. She has so much data supporting the importance of these 3 different areas of focus for optimal functioning, especially in times of stress. If we look on the right side of the slide in the yellow, really when we are faced with significant stress, what happens is cortisol is released in our bodies. And high levels of cortisol can interfere with our sleep and consequently can further cause difficulties in our ability to pay attention and to learn, in our emotion regulation. And when we aspire towards improved health and well-being, we are largely aspiring toward more optimal brain functioning. So what can we do, or what should we do, and what should we be encouraging of our students, and what should we be encouraging our students to encourage their students and families if they can continue to engage with them? First, make sure that we're all getting good and adequate amounts of sleep. Go to bed 30 minutes earlier or stay in bed 30 minutes longer if that's possible. Establish a healthy sleep routine. If you can't get in a healthy sleep routine and get enough sleep at night, then take what they call sleep proxies, right? Take these 20-minute naps when possible. And if you can't nap, and I'm not a napper, I haven't been able to nap since I've had children, sleep proxies can also be mindfulness meditation. So spending that, that period of time really just focused and centered. If you are a napper, make sure that you're keeping it to 20 minutes because you'll really risk waking up feeling worse, feeling groggy and disengaged if you sleep longer. That other bucket, practice more frequently and with great consistencies the strategies that help you to cope with stress, right? So truthfully, no stress doesn't help optimal brain functioning, and high levels of stress don't support optimal brain functioning, but moderate amounts of stress do. And so how do we ensure that we are coping with all of the stressors that we're faced with so that we're experiencing a moderate level of stress? And this could be anything. It could be the things that Grace was talking about, but it could be practices outside of that. It could be exercise, yoga, breathing, talking with loved ones. And then I would finally say adopt practices that are focused on positivity and gratitude. Be really intentional and routine in journaling or in mindfulness exercises that focus on gratitude and positivity. Do them consistently if you're finding that you're feeling heightened worry and negativity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jean. Again, as a reminder, participants, if you have any questions for Grace or Jean at this point, please direct chat them to me so that I can direct them back to our panelists during the whole group Q&A. And now I'll turn it over to our final panelist, Xavier.
Thank you, Taylor. So just getting started, within the current state of the pandemic that we're currently in, just like my colleague stated, I think that it's very, very important to know that stress is not always a bad thing. I think it's extremely important to be able to engage in acceptance and knowing that, we can't control what's going on, and to really, really focus on what we can control within ourselves, within our routines, within how we care for ourselves, within how we care for others, and what are our daily tasks that we participate in. The first thing that I would like to bring to attention is what my colleague stated earlier, but quieting the noise around us, really knowing, what are our trigger points, how are our moods, how are our behaviors, at what points in time do we need temperature checks throughout the day, whether we're engaging with students, whether we're completing assignments, completing tasks, and we're not feeling our best, knowing when to take a step back and to be able to engage in a meditation or some sort of mindfulness. The other thing is to be able to utilize imagining possibility. I think this is such a great recommendation that my colleague Grace shared earlier, is really imagining, utilizing this time to, think about, what are our goals? What do we want to come to fruition? How can we be most productive? How can we refine and develop ourselves? And what do we want our futures once this pandemic is over to look like, to feel like? I think utilizing reflection is a great way to do that. For teachers, looking at, how far our students have come, how far our students have developed, what skills have we imparted into them and how have we helped them grow, and reminding them of that. And for our student teachers, thinking about the same thing, thinking about the relationships, the connections, the rapport that you develop with your youth, and remembering that and reminding them of that. Another thing that comes to mind for me is movement. Getting our heart rate up, exercising, stretching, doing things that will increase our serotonin levels and our dopamine levels to allow us to have a sense of fulfillment. And most importantly, connecting with others, knowing that social distancing is not social isolation. We think about things like laughter, humor, opening our hearts to our students, to our families, to our friends, realizing how much we are truly connected. Being an anchor for our students, as one of my colleagues stated earlier. One of the things that I find extreme value in is connecting with students and, listening, engaging in active listening and hearing, how things are going for them, having genuine conversations and simply letting them know that, they're in my thoughts and they're in my prayers, and having conversations about their goals, what they're interested in, and really, really allowing yourself to reduce their stress levels and allowing them to reduce yours. A few points that my colleagues mentioned earlier, again, that I would like to reiterate, is having compassion for ourselves, getting into a routine, something that is built in, starting small, and allowing ourselves to settle our minds, allowing ourselves to breathe, to have compassion for ourselves, to feel, and most importantly, to be productive. These tasks will allow us to reduce our stress and to ultimately build our resilience.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Xavier. So with that, I'd like to open it up to some of your questions now. And I'd like to start with this one, which is, what are some of the limitations and opportunities for using some of these strategies that you discussed and having conversations around mental health in virtual spaces? So panelists, I'd invite all of you to turn on your videos and audio, and I would love to hear your thoughts about bringing these strategies and conversations into virtual spaces. And I think that goes both ways, teacher educators with student teachers and student teachers with their students.
I'll start. I've been thinking a lot about this as a counselor educator who was forced to put classes online seemingly overnight. And counseling classes, like teacher education classes, are all about connection. And so it's been critically important for us to structure our online learning in a way that opens up a lot of space for connection. And so starting classes with community building exercises, supporting students to connect with each other, to connect with faculty, creating rituals around that has been very important. You know, really truncating the learning piece into smaller segments. I think a lot about, as a trauma therapist, I think a lot about Bruce Perry's work. And he talks about regulate, relate, and reason, meaning, and that's, you know, very synonymous with the brain states I talked about. So we start through connection because connection helps to regulate people, but when we also incorporate some mindfulness exercises or some grounding exercises to help people feel safe and grounded and ready to learn, we introduce some of the learning that requires that cortex being online and incorporating new information. And then we kind of start right back again. Then we connect and we regulate and we learn. And it's that cycle. But allowing more space, really thinking about what's most critical to teach versus what's kind of superfluous and not so necessary, so that we can make space for those other conversations.
In terms of, so I'm similar. We were forced to move everything online within a few days. So in terms of the practice with the students that I'm working with right now, I actually work with one Buddhist students and also acupuncture students. But one of our practices is, since we are online for the majority of the day, we also do what's called a digital detox. So it's an intention to say, I will put this digital aside and I'll turn off notifications, because just from a personal experience, what I was finding was I was just constantly looking at the news or constantly reading the news or constantly on Zoom meetings, and I was getting exhausted physically, mentally. So just taking a chunk of the day to, make an intention to put the digital technology aside. And then in that sense, as my colleagues had mentioned before, really connect with at least the people that you're with or outside. So that's just one of the things that we're practicing at our institute.
Thank you so much.
I agree. One of the biggest things for working with my students is routine. And the way in which we do this is typically when I have group meetings or I have one-on-one meetings, we start with a meditation. We start with opening ourselves up, allowing ourselves to recenter. And we spend a lot of time having conversations about what are our short-term and long-term goals for the day. I work with a lot of students at the Community College of Philadelphia, students who are duly enrolled, even though they may not have a lot of courses at the high school level. Now they still have courses at the college level, and they still have responsibilities. So being able to help them synthesize and navigate through those responsibilities, knowing what they can do, what they're motivated to do, allowing them to really, really center themselves and to be as productive as possible. And typically what we do is before we part ways, we end in a meditation and allow them to carry out through that day and follow up with them.
Thank you so much. We have a question from a participant named Victoria James. Victoria asks, do you all have any specific skills, tools, or resources that are highly impactful and applicable in work with teachers and students? So perhaps thinking about the strategies that you all recommended, are there any resources that you would like to recommend to our participants?
So there's an application called Nature Space that a lot of my students really, really enjoy. Nature Space allows students to listen to nature, whether it's a waterfall, whether it's the wind, whether it's birds chirping. And this is really, really a good tactic to use when you're trying to get students to recenter and to open themselves up.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Jean and Grace, do you have any resources that you'd like to recommend?
So for me, I think that I feel like I'm on resource overload right now. I feel like my inbox is just continuously filling up with new resources related to stress reduction and COVID and all kinds of things. And I would just say that there is no one size fits all, that that you yourself are, if you ask yourself the question, you know, think about the last time that I felt out of control. How did I calm myself, right? What did I do? What were the steps that I took? That's probably the best place to start. And you know yourself very well. And I often tell my students to ask that of the children that they work with as well, that people are pretty insightful around the kinds of things that work for them. But I also don't want people to be stuck in a box, right? Because maybe it's not working as well as something else might be. So I want you to be creative and flexible. You know, I think we should be asking each other what we utilize that's successful, and we should practice these things together in connection with others. So that was, I don't have a good resource, but I just had some ideas about.
I think that's an important reminder that we are our own resources in any way, in many ways, and our experiences are themselves a great resource to us. So thank you for that reminder, Jean. Grace, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, actually, Jean mentioned before about the practice of gratitude, which I think is very powerful. So two of the practices that I'm currently doing right now with other people via chat rooms is that one is, you know, this practice of gratitude where we have, you know, several people in a group, and every day we just text each other something that we're grateful for as a reminder. Especially things that we've taken for granted. That's what we've been realizing. Another practice is the journaling. Journaling, but a different type, it's a mindful journaling. So I'm writing down a situation exactly as it happened, as if I'm taking a picture. So if somebody says something to me that irked me, that disturbed me, I'll write it down exactly how it happened. And I'll just see how I responded. What were the emotions that came up for me? And what's been powerful about that is that I've also been able to share this with a friend, and we discuss it together. And I ask her for her wisdom, you know, in this situation, what would you have done? You know, and then just having that connection has helped me to really look at myself, but also get the advice from other people. So that's been helpful during this time.
Thank you so much. Again, thank you to all of our panelists. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for whole group Q&A. However, we would love for this conversation to continue in smaller groups. This session goes until 4 p.m. and so to save time for discussion, we're going to divide into breakout rooms now, and we will not come back together at the end of the session. So before we divvy ourselves up, I'd like to take a moment to say that the Collaboratory's goal is to make these conversations as useful for you as we can. To that end, we would love for you to complete the very brief feedback form that you'll see noted in blue on the slide, which is also in the chat right now. We would love to know what you thought of today's session and what you learned during the breakout conversations that you're about to have. We will now divide into breakout rooms where we invite you to turn on your audio and video and discuss these two guiding questions. First, how can you apply what you heard from the panelists to your own practice? And secondly, what other strategies have you used to sustain your own and prospective teachers' mental health and well-being? We ask that one person in each room please volunteer to be the group facilitator, who will keep track of time and encourage all participants to share. And finally, before we move into breakout rooms, we want to remind you that if anything occurs in your room that makes you uncomfortable, you can leave immediately by clicking Return to the main meeting. Again, thank you to everyone for joining us, and thank you to our panelists, Grace, Jean, and Xavier, for sharing your wisdom with us.